I'm calling to order this hearing. This is a public hearing of the Committee of the Whole of the Council of the District of Columbia. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chair of the Council and Chair of the Committee of the Whole. Today is Wednesday, September 30th, 2020. The time is 9:08 in the morning, and the subject of this hearing is Bill 23-316, entitled the Tax Revision Commission Reestablishment Amendment Act of 2019. This legislation was introduced on June 4th, 2019 by Council members Che, Todd, Robert White, Jack Evans, then Council member, Charles Allen, Anita Bonds, Brianne Nadeau, and David Grasso. The stated purpose of this legislation is to reestablish the Tax Revision Commission and to require the Commission to submit a report of recommendations once every 10 years to consider revisions to the tax code. The Council has legislated a Tax Revision Commission several times since the advent of Home Rule. There was a Tax Revision Commission in 1978. There was another one created in 1996, as I recall. And then there was a Tax Revision Commission created in 2010. The recommendations of the Tax Revision Commission in 2010, commission which was chaired by former Mayor Anthony Williams, were considered and largely adopted by the Council in, I believe, 2014. As a result of our restructuring the individual income tax, reflecting the recommendations of the Tax Revision Commission, the Council received several awards for making our income tax more progressive, and I believe the most progressive of income tax structures in the country. So the subject of this hearing is that legislation, that is Bill 23-316. We have 22 witnesses. I'm going to ask, call on witnesses 11 at a time. So I'm splitting the panel, so to speak, in two. We're on a fairly tight time frame because since this hearing is being conducted virtually, we have to conclude this hearing by noon. The record in this matter will be open for 2 weeks. That is, the record will close at 5 p.m. on October 14th, 2020. And if one looks at the hearing notice, you can see how you can submit testimony or comments in writing. So those who are testifying today, if they didn't have statements that they've given to us, or they want to supplement their remarks, you have 2 weeks to do so. If anybody is paying attention and not on the witness list, you can submit testimony or statements within the next 2 weeks. And again, the details for doing that are in the hearing notice, and the hearing notice is available through the Council's website, www.dccouncil.us. So those who signed up to testify were given the ability to, they were given a link and the ability to get into what we call the waiting room, and the first 11 are going to be let in, and I will call their names. Devon Jones, who's chair of the NAACP DC Branch Economic Committee. Yeshim Sayin Taylor, who's executive director of the DC Policy Center. Lisa Mallory, who is the chief executive officer of the DC Building Industry Association. Tazra Mitchell, who is the policy director at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. Rabbi Elena Zeitman, who's listed as a public witness, that is with no affiliation, and she's taking the place of Jesse Rabinowitz, who I will call later in the second panel. Ed Lazier, who's listed as a public witness. Angela Franco, who's the interim president and chief executive officer of the DC Chamber of Commerce. Catherine Landfield, listed as a public witness. Kashini Ludawahadi, who is listed as a public witness. Tim Hampton, also listed as a public witness. And David Schwartzman, who is chair of the Political Policy and Action Committee with the DC Statehood Green Party. The hearing notice indicated that witnesses would have 3 minutes to testify. Actually, the hearing notice said, or less time if there are a large number of witnesses, and there are a large number of witnesses, but I think we can get by with 3 minutes for each. Let me check with the committee director to see if everybody is in. we're missing two people, but if they knock on the door, so to speak, they will be let in. So let me go to Yesham Sayin Taylor. If you are on, please proceed with your testimony. And you have 3 minutes. You should be able to see on your screen a clock.
I do.
And it will count down. I will let you know if you go over your time.
Okay.
Ms. Taylor.
Good morning, Chairman Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. My name is Yesham Sayin Taylor, and I'm the Executive Director of DC Policy Center. I thank you for the opportunity to testify on this very important legislation. As you have noted, the district has in the past demonstrated its commitment to sound tax policies. Since the Revitalization Act, we have constituted 2 tax revision commissions, and the city has adopted the recommendations from these commissions with minor modifications. But in between, sometimes our commitment to sound and efficient and fair and competitive tax policies can be impaired a little bit. Usually when the council is working under the budget pressure, sometimes tax policy can turn into an exercise in finding getting to a number that allows us to fill a hole in the budget. And for these reasons, it is really important for the district right now to really keep committed to a fair, simple, and competitive tax policy. Obviously, it's unreasonable for a city to have a tax regime that doesn't change. But especially given that we're living under an economic recession induced by a pandemic, the creation of a commission is even more important. Such a commission can create a catalog of good tax policy the city can consider. And the tax revision commissions can build these proposals without feeling the pressure of a budget season. In the past, tax revision commissions have produced good policies, and they have also built consensus. And this consensus has been strong enough to lead the city to adopt their recommendations. As the city goes through this difficult time where revenues are declining and needs are increasing, you will be told that you should be increasing taxes. That's really secondary. Obviously, taxes pay for important investments, but what has led to the fiscal renaissance of the city was not higher taxes. What led to the fiscal renaissance of the city was a growing population, growing jobs, and growing businesses. So a tax regime should really be careful about protecting this growth. Without the growth, there is no resources to pay for the important needs that are in the city. And now, especially with the pandemic, what has made the district a destination, amenities, quality of life, infrastructure, investments in transportation infrastructure are going to be held for a while. This makes it even more important to have a tax revision commission that can help the city formulate a tax policy that's simple, fair, and will protect the city's future growth. I thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor. Lisa Mallory.
Good morning, Chairman Mendelson, members of the committee and staff. My name is Lisa Mallory, and I'm CEO of the District of Columbia Building Industry Association. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and we're pleased that Councilmember Mary Cheh introduced this act last year, joined by a majority of her colleagues, and that the chairman is holding this hearing. DCBIA strongly supports this legislation. We have been a consistent advocate for the district to have carefully conceived tax policy that advances the economic competitiveness of the city and ensures its long-term health. A vibrant private sector and commercial and residential real estate industry are critical to helping the district achieve its many ambitious policy goals, not just as major contributors to the city's revenue, but also as partners, whether it is cutting carbon emissions by half by 2032 or producing 36,000 new units by 2025. We have seen this year just how important it is to grow the economy and responsibly manage our finances and reserves. Due to the wisdom and tough decision of leaders in the past, the district has so far been able to continue services without major furloughs or deep cuts during the ongoing public health emergency. public health emergency. However, more challenges and uncertainty lie ahead. Continued discipline, leadership, and collaboration are necessary to ensure that we have economic recovery that lifts all residents and businesses. The Tax Revision Commission is an effective tool for the strategic policy making that this moment calls for. It is a panel of experts and stakeholders tasked with studying the district's tax system and making policy recommendations for officials based on agreed upon principles. As we have seen in recent years, it is tempting for elected officials to simply make piecemeal changes to the tax code to pay for priorities year to year. For example, in 2019, the council adopted an increase in commercial real property taxes and made the district's deed and recordation taxes the highest in the country. And earlier this year, the council considered, and to its credit, rejected several tax increases on businesses and residents that were only put forth in the final weeks of the budget process. These unvetted policy decisions, sometimes made in the final hour, are not a sound way to do tax policy. Credibility was a key component of the last commission's effectiveness. By law, the commission comprises 5 members, each appointed by the mayor and the chair, and appointed by the mayor and chairman, consisting of tax experts, 1 community rep, and 1 business rep, and the CFO. We believe that Mayor Williams was exactly what the commission needed to be effective and credible, and we think that the legal framework for the last commission and how it was applied was critical to its success. It is fitting that this hearing is being held the day the CFO announces his amended revenue estimates, and now is the right time to establish this tax revision commission. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Ms. Mallory. And I don't think we have a copy of your statement.
Oh, we'll provide that immediately. Thank you.
Thank you. Although I think I'm hearing from staff we did get it. I'll let you know. I'll update you. And I should say, everyone who's testifying, please stay logged in because when we're done with the first 11, I may have some questions for you. The next witness is Tazra Mitchell, who is the Policy Director at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute.
Hi, good morning, Chairperson and members of the committee. Thank you for the chance to testify. My name is Tazra Mitchell, and I'm the Policy Director at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. We can all agree that rigorous and regular evaluations of tax policy is essential. And we can agree that the last tax commission process led to some positive improvements, such as the EITC expansion. However, DCFPI believes that another commission isn't the solution that we need in this unprecedented moment, nor is it the best process designed to consistently bolster data-driven policies. Our district is in crisis. Revenues are shrinking. Tens of thousands of our neighbors are out of work, going hungry, and falling behind on rent. And every day, small businesses are closing shop. Black and brown residents and businesses are suffering the most. The district doesn't need another white paper to suggest how to respond to this economic crisis today or grow an inclusive economy long-term. The primary goal of revenue policy is to raise enough revenue to meet the critical needs of DC residents and invest in the building blocks of a strong economy, and to do so fairly, or in a way that asks more from those with the greatest ability to give. We can and should do both, and voters agree. There's already ample national evidence that the pandemic is leaving the highest income residents the least harmed, yet they're the ones in the district paying a smaller share of their income on total local taxes compared to the middle class, and they're disproportionately benefiting from huge Trump tax cuts. It is a policy choice, and a very racialized one, to allow this to continue while half of DC children lived in renter households behind on rent, who were going hungry, or both, in July. In addition to not being timely, some of the last commissions, not always being timely, once every decade, would not respond to a moment like this. In addition to that point, some of the last commission's recommendations were politicized rather than evidence-based, such as a recommendation to lower the franchise tax, despite research given to the commission showing that a cut wasn't warranted, and that's concerning to us. An alternative idea to the commission is to fund additional capacity in the council budget office to conduct ongoing nonpartisan research and analysis of the recommendations to improve our tax system. They're already well equipped to do this, and this would ensure that neutral experts are keeping a pulse on the latest tax research, fairly assessing how tax policies are meeting their intended goals, and periodically developing evidence-based recommendations available to council and the public. And a complementary idea is to hold a revenue hearing early in the budget process so there's an opportunity to assess and debate whether revenue changes are needed to keep up with growing needs, so these things aren't punted to the last minute during the budget debate. And this is something that we called for back in January. Now, if the council moves forward with this bill, we recommend you to update the criteria that directs the commission's work, focusing more on principles that advance equity, adequacy, and inclusive growth, rather than competitiveness, given where the research lies about interstate tax differences. Going forward, recommendations should be evaluated with an eye towards income and race. That means disaggregating data by race in the tax models that are assessing if and how a policy would have a disparate impact. We cannot afford to go forward with a colorblind approach to tax policy. DCFPI is eager to see progress in improving adequacy and equity in our tax code, and we are willing to help in any way that we can. Thank you for the chance to testify.
Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. Rabbi Elena Zeitman.
Good morning, Chairperson Mendelson and members of the committee. My name is Rabbi Ilana Zeitman. I'm a resident of Ward 1. I'm testifying today because, like you, I am worried about the urgent needs of the most vulnerable in our city and those increasingly at risk of becoming vulnerable. You already know about the looming unemployment, eviction, homelessness, and childcare crises throughout DC, which will only get worse the longer you delay. Now is the time to address these issues because the livelihoods and well-being of deserving men, women, and children are at risk right now. I'm calling on you to act now for revenue justice. The sole focus cannot and should not be on the Tax Revision Commission, but rather real action that will ensure that all of our neighbors pay their fair share in taxes and that everyone can have an equitable chance to thrive. I'm asking you this as a resident who does not take having a job for granted and is willing to personally pay more in taxes because it is not only fair, it's the right thing to do in this desperate economic situation and frightening pandemic. It's what each of us would want were we lacking a home, sufficient health care, or other crucial help. I'm also coming to you today as a rabbi and community leader in this city. Jewish tradition teaches us that everyone in a society is responsible for one another's livelihoods. God commands us in Deuteronomy 15:4, there shall be no needy among you, no needy person, not a single one. That's the goal at all times. But our Torah also tells us a few verses later, if, however, there is a needy person among you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against them. While we should always strive to live in a perfected world and to know it is possible, my tradition also says to be aware of and to respond to the realities of our time, and to do so by taking care of those among us who struggle. They do not need to do anything to deserve justice and dignity from the society they live in, other than to be a fellow human being. Now is not the time to harden our hearts, nor is it the time to give in to the fear of scarcity by delaying economic solutions to our city's dire problems. Judaism tells us that we must never delay in providing support to the poor and needy. While Jews usually take the time to say a blessing over every mitzvah or commandment, the commandment of tzedakah, of giving justly, is not one of them. There should be no pause or interruption when it comes to sharing our wealth. I support making informed decisions and want my city's council to think critically about our economy and to know when it's time to study and when it is time to act. It should be obvious to you that the time to act is now. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Rabbi. Ed Lazier.
Good morning, Chairman Mendelson and members of the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to testify today. My name's Ed Lazier, and I'm a candidate for DC Council at Large. I had the honor of serving on the most recent DC Tax Revision Commission led by Mayor Williams. It was a deeply meaningful experience for me, but I also feel it was a flawed approach to developing sound tax policy, and I'm here today to oppose this bill to establish a regular tax commission. Instead, I encourage the council to take the best from the last commission and incorporate it into the council's regular operations. The best aspect of the DC Tax Revision Commission is that the district devoted substantial resources to research on tax policy. We learned, for example, about the importance of reviewing tax expenditures for their effectiveness. We gained new knowledge of DC's business income taxes and in the surrounding region, and many other topics. However, I found the process to be flawed in fundamental ways that were tied to its structure. First, Through the commission, the DC Council delegated important revenue policy recommendations to people who are not DC residents. This led the commission to make recommendations that the public may not have agreed with. For example, while the commission started with the goal of developing recommendations that would be revenue neutral, we ended up making recommendations that had a substantial loss of revenues. In another example, the commission recommended a cut in taxes for residents with $5 million estates, things that I do not think DC residents agree with. Beyond that, in the end, the commission really turned into a negotiation between business interests and low-income interests, rather than a reasoned debate on sound tax policy. For example, the commission recommended cutting the estate tax despite no research or testimony to support it, just because one commissioner wanted it and we were working on a consensus basis. The commission also recommended deep cuts in business income taxes despite research done for the commission showing that our current tax policy was not hurting DC's business competitiveness. And this was because the business interests on the council wanted it. This means that the people appointed to any tax commission are likely to have a bigger impact on the outcomes than the findings of its research, and that's wrong. I'm also concerned that holding a tax commission every 10 years would get in the way of regularly reviewing and improving the tax code. I don't think the council needs a tax commission to inform good tax policy, just as it doesn't need a commission for most of its policymaking. Instead, I encourage the council to hire one or more staff for the council budget office to engage in ongoing tax policy review, including as the council makes changes to the tax code. In addition, I encourage the council to find ways to engage the entire body in conversations about revenue policy every year. In particular, I support having the full council engage in at least one hearing early on the budget process to have a conversation on revenue policy for that fiscal year. Thank you for this opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lazier. Angela Franco, who's the interim president and CEO of the Chamber of Commerce.
Good morning, Chairman Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. My name is Angela Franco. I'm the interim president and CEO of the DC Chamber of Commerce. I'm pleased to offer our support and comments on Bill 23-316, the Tax Revision Commission Reestablishment Amendment Act of 2019. Today, the DC Chamber is working aggressively to expand the economy in the district by attracting new jobs and creating opportunities for our businesses to help them move out of the crisis and help restore the economy. The DC Chamber also focuses on issues that impact our future growth and community development, including workforce development, international trade, and tax reform. At the DC Chamber of Commerce, we believe that it's important for the growth and development of our jurisdiction that we focus on economic diversification and policies like Bill 23-316 that support the interest of the business community and foster job creation so that the district's economy progresses competitively. Over the years, the DC Chamber has analyzed our economic and regulatory landscape from the perspective of ensuring that the district becomes and remains the best place to live, work, and do business. In doing so, we understand that at the center of this work is how we build a competitive city, one that is attractive not just to businesses, but workers and residents all at once. The DC Chamber believes that tax rules should be simple, predictable, and easy to understand to improve compliance and reduce costs. Reestablishing the Tax Revision Commission every 10 years will help ensure that this goal is being met. However, the unpredictability of business conditions, including new taxes made outside of the Commission's recommendations, additional regulations, and other employer requirements, is one of the most highly cited concerns for profitability among these businesses. Tax differences between jurisdictions, especially in a regional economy such as ours, have a noticeable effect on where businesses locate. These tax differences must be highlighted and analyzed to ensure the mayor and the council are making informed decisions regarding tax policies that do not result in the reduction of our tax base due to companies turning to other states that have more favorable tax policies. Accordingly, the DC Chamber of Commerce proposes that the Reestablished Tax Revision Commission consider the following recommendations. The first one, require economic impact statements for all legislation. I'm gonna shorten it up because my time is coming up. So the first one, the Chamber recommends the implementation of economic impact analysis for all proposed legislation. The second one is the elimination of the ad hoc tax policies and really doing a study of what the impact is. And then propose new incentive for growing sectors, especially after the COVID is over. Thank you so much for your time and consideration of the District of Chambers of Commerce viewpoint. The DC Chamber looks forward to working with you to find solutions to the challenges facing our city. Thank you very much, and I'm available to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Franco. Catherine Landfield?
Good morning, Chairman Mendelson and members of the committee. My name is Catherine Landfield and I live in Ward 3. I am a former longtime school social worker and am deeply concerned about the well-being of working poor Black and Brown families in DC. I volunteer with Fair Budget Coalition, JUFJ, and PAVE in order to advocate for policies that can improve the hardships my students faced. Our DC community is in crisis now, and we need nimble responses to our revenue shortfall. A years-long tax commission process is simply not timely or useful in addressing our dire pandemic recovery needs. At this time, it is critical to grow the city's revenue by finding ways for the highest earners and the most profitable businesses to contribute their fair share. Specifically, I urge you to start by increasing the income tax on the top 10% of earners, including on my own family. After that, let's continue on with other ideas that jurisdictions are using to make the tax system more fair and more functional for meeting their state's needs. There are many, many examples that are already out there. Those in the bottom halves of income and wealth, who are overwhelmingly non-white, face significantly higher rates of unemployment, loss of wages, exposure to COVID, and even death. This leaves them unable to pay the rent or buy the food that they need, among other problems. But we are in a K-shaped recovery that has allowed me and most of affluent DC, which is not coincidentally overwhelmingly white, to remain secure during the pandemic. I often feel as if I am living on a different planet when I read about the nightmare others are living through. After the Great Recession, we saw a drastic widening of the racial wealth and income gaps and intensified housing loss. We are already seeing this happen again, and we need the council to act quickly to prevent further entrenchment. In this context, it is useful to be reminded that these are choices. We have power to change the rules of our tax system. We can change them in order to shape and achieve more equitable outcomes. We must set an intentional course to a just recovery. There is no racial justice without tax justice. However, thus far, the mayor and the council have asked for no shared sacrifice from those of us who are most comfortable. It is urgent that we pay our fair share. And please do not believe the howls that the affluent cannot afford it. We most certainly can, simply by doing a bit of budgeting. Moreover, research has already shown that the vast majority of us won't move out of DC to flee higher taxes, especially when those taxes lead to more stable, healthy, and flourishing communities. It is time to raise taxes on the highest income earners and the wealthy in order to ensure that our city becomes the truly inclusive and equitable city that we all profess to want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Landfield. Ms. Little-Hetty?
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman Mendelson, Council Members Silverman and Pinto. My name is Keish Ladua-Hetty. I'm Operations Director for DC for Democracy. I'm testifying today to represent our members' strong opposition to this bill. Our community is facing a crisis that is unprecedented in my lifetime. In the last 20 years, rising wealth and income inequality have harmed our community, with particular harm to Black and Brown communities. The pandemic and the resulting economic crash have turned that harm into catastrophe. Again, especially for Black and Brown residents. We are in a crisis that the DC Council must address with appropriate urgency. The last thing we need is a tax revision commission that will take years to research and deliberate. We need the DC Council to use its legitimate powers now to protect the public against disaster. We actively participated in the last Tax Revision Commission. We attended meetings, testified, and advocated for reforms to make our tax system more fair. That commission was chaired by the sitting head of the Federal City Council, one of the most powerful business lobbies in DC. And while the commission included other members who represented the vast majority of DC residents, the leadership ensured that corporate interests were favored. We should not repeat such an unbalanced approach. It is time for the council to take responsibility for raising adequate revenues to address the crisis at the scale it demands. The obscene income inequality of recent decades is not due to merit or natural law. It is due to economic policies that allow a few at the top to take far more than their fair share. The most recent example is the Trump tax bill, where the wealthiest 5% of DC residents got $564 million in tax cuts in 2019 alone. This inequality is also baked into the DC tax code, which may be the least regressive in the nation, but is certainly not progressive or fair. It's basically a flat tax that exacts the same percentage of taxes at all income levels, a policy goal long sought by right-wing interests. The council needs to set this right by taking responsibility for raising the revenues we need to meet this crisis in the fairest way possible. Create a new position within the council budget office to research tax policy and outline policy options that will both further racial equity and ensure fiscal responsibility. This position can be very helpful with the revenue side of the annual budget process. Council members can then debate these recommendations and weigh the political considerations involved. As our elected representatives, you are better qualified to do this work than another commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Leto-Heady. Tim Hampton, is he on? Then David Schwartzman.
Yes, good morning. I represent the DC State Green Party, and I did testify to the last Tax Revision Commission in 2014. We urge you reject this bill to create another TRC. This initiative is a transparent attempt to postpone the consideration of a long overdue tax hike on our wealthy residents and big corporate sector that is urgently needed to provide revenue to address the deep social and economic crisis now being faced by majority Black and brown working class residents. We don't need another TRC to inform the council how to adjust DC tax burdens, which are now bear heaviest on our working and middle class residents. We already know how to make our tax structure truly progressive, sustainable, and more capable of generating essential revenue to fund a just budget. You failed us in your disgraceful rejection of a very modest DC income tax hike on wealthy residents last July. New Jersey is implementing a 2% rate increase for millionaires, and now New York is considering a similar approach. This tax hike in New Jersey will recover a large share of the Trump tax cuts coming to these millionaires. You should follow New Jersey's example by addressing budget shortfalls and inadequate budgeting. The council must take the lead in not only addressing budget shortfalls, but pass legislation to reduce DC's large racial and economic disparities in a just economic recovery. Here is an alternative that we suggest the council should implement. One, recover the big Trump tax cut for wealthy residents, amounting to $400 million this year for those making over $350,000 a year income by hiking their DC income tax rates and begin to borrow from these future revenues now. This step would leave these taxpayers paying the same federal plus DC income taxes as before the Trump tax law was implemented. Further, pass a surcharge on high income residents. 3% surcharge of those earning over $500,000 a year would generate about $300 million in more revenue. Again, helping to recover their tax cut they're getting from the CARES Act. Act now to take back subsidies to big developers building luxury housing in the big corporate sector, and of course defund MPD to adequate budget for the most vulnerable in our community. In addition, the council should provide income support totaling $74 million to our low-income residents by a rebate of their sales taxes, starting with family incomes below $25,000 a year. And this would correspond to about $800 rebate a year for these families.
Mr.
Right.
Schwartzman, your time is up. You need to conclude.
Am I running out of time?
You're over your
Yes, I
time by a
will.
minute.
Oh, I'm sorry. So finally, I ask our mayor and DC council once again, why are those most affluent in our community pampered while low-income people continue to suffer? Will you act now for just recovery? Thank you for the extra time.
I want to thank each of you for your testimony. I do have some questions, but I think I'm going to turn to colleagues first. And at the beginning of the hearing, I believe Councilmember Pinto was on, and I was unaware of that. That's my mistake. So Councilmember Pinto, I'll recognize you first if you want to make a statement or you have questions. And then I see Councilmember Silverman. I don't believe there are any other council members present. Councilmember Pinto?
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Mendelson, and thank you all for testifying. I think many of you have noted in your testimony that this pandemic has brought really unprecedented challenges to our city. Our unemployment claims have crippled our outdated processing system, and many businesses are struggling to keep afloat. And these challenges are the very real lived experiences of DC residents all across the district. And we are called as lawmakers to address these challenges through thoughtful, transparent, and inclusive policymaking, and tax policy is not exempt from those standards. And so it's very important that the changes that we make are thorough and thoughtful and have meaningful opportunity for community and public input. So I'm very committed to exploring the best way to address tax policy and look forward to working with you all and my colleagues to ensure that our tax policy meets the needs of our DC residents today and serves as a catalyst for growth in the future. So I do have some questions for some of our panelists. So Ms. Taylor, you testified in support of the commission. How do you think that the commissioner should be selected, and how can we ensure that it represents diversity, both of race, background, gender, but also diversity of viewpoint?
Thank you for the question. I think that the most important job of a tax revision commission is to think of policies that can generate the most resources for the city so the city can meet its needs, but with as few disincentives as possible so economic activity continues. So an element of this is obviously a technical knowledge. So there should be members of the Tax Revision Commission that are well versed in tax policy. But beyond that, just like in the last Tax Revision Commission, the commission should include advocates for the most vulnerable residents, and as well as business interests. I heard earlier that the consensus elements of the Tax Revision Commission may be considered as a bad thing, but in some ways, in order to be able to pass policy, there needs to be some level of consensus. That consensus can be created in a highly political environment like the budget, or it could be created in a different environment that's less political. So I think in that sense, the Tax Revision Commission would be an alternative. Ultimately, it's up to the council to adopt its policies. That to me is a very important distinction to make. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Rabbi Zeitman, you spoke about wealthy residents paying their fair share how do you define what fair share, what constitutes a fair share, and how do you recommend that we frame that question, particularly if we do not establish a commission?
Sure. Well, I first, of course, want to defer to the economic and policy experts that are testifying throughout the day. And I think, as Catherine was saying, our fair share is what we're able to pay, even if we have to rebudget for ourselves, but what we're able to pay in order to still be able to live. But there's a lot that that I am willing to pay to be able to allow others to have their basic resources met.
Okay, thank you so much. And Mr. Lazier, you can touch on that. We only have a little over a minute left. But in addition to that question of how we should be defining fair share, in your experience on the previous commission, was each tax proposal recommended and then researched and discussed, or was there a return to our kind of key values and programs that need to be spent and need to be paid for, and then a determination about how to raise all of the revenue for our city? And in your view, which approach should we employ going forward?
Thank you for that question, Councilmember Pinto. To answer your second question, I think the impact of our decisions on the city's ability to fund services wasn't a consideration of the commission at all, which is, I think, part of the problem of why having a commission that's divorced from the budget process and from legislators is a problem. Because, as I said, we started with a goal of being revenue neutral and then tossed it out the window when the commission couldn't agree on revenue increases to offset the substantial revenue cuts that we were proposing. So I do think it would be, that's again why I think this is a process that should be handled by the people who actually manage the budget as well, not by people separate from that. And to your first question, I don't know that there's an immediate answer, but the fact that million district pay an income tax rate that is 0.5% or less than 0.5% higher than a teacher or a nurse pays, it's a little bit like what we learned about Donald Trump and his taxes this week. It's clearly not much of a gap. And I think if you ask the average DC resident if that difference in tax rates between a millionaire and a nurse is reasonable, and they would say, I think they would say no. And there certainly are other states that have a much larger gap between the tax on the highest income residents and middle income residents than the district does. In that way, other states have more progressive income taxes than the district does.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, Ms. Ledowedy, you spoke about raising income taxes on the highest earners. A kind of similar question, but how would you propose that cutoff income level is determined? There's been proposals for $250,000 a year. There's been proposals for $350,000 a year. But what do you think the best metric is to make the determination of that cutoff for that proposal?
Well, I mean, I think that we have to take into make some kind of determination as to we know, for example, the distribution, income distribution in DC, and I think that it's fair enough to say that the top 1% versus the top 5% versus the top 10 to 20% have very, very different lifestyles and financial security from the 50% level or the 30% of adjusted gross income. I mean, I'm not a wealthy person, and yet it's like Catherine said, when you have financial security in these times and you don't really have to pay attention to how much you pay for groceries. I mean, I feel like even though I'm not wealthy, I can definitely pay more than I am right now. I mean, it's absurd to me that I'm spending my time volunteering for mutual aid in Ward 7 and 8 in order to have this haphazard volunteer-run operation to get food to DC families, when it would be made so much more efficient for me to pay more tax revenues so that the city can pay people to do that job. It's an insane way to run a society. So if I, as a modest income person, am willing to pay more money, I mean, I'm just imagining the people who are living in the McMansions a few blocks away from me I know the lifestyle. I can see the lifestyle that they have. It just seems to me that we can make some decisions about what the richest 1% of DC residents can pay, the richest 5%, the richest 10%, the richest 25%, and then, you know, have some tax brackets that actually conform to the level, to the socioeconomic levels in this.
Thank you very much. Apologize, Chairman. I realize I'm over time, so we'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Pinto. Councilmember Silverman, did you have questions?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good morning to you and good morning to everyone. We have a 5-minute round, Mr. Chairman, is that correct?
Yes, but Councilmember Pinto went for just about 8 minutes, so I'll give you 8 minutes.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Well, Mr. Chairman, this was touched upon by some of our witnesses, but I think one of the biggest conundrums we face, and this was true pre-COVID, but is even more so true now, is that even though the 2013 Tax Revision Commission made our tax system one of the most progressive, according to analysts, and I know you often mention that, income inequality and racial inequity has continued to grow and actually get worse since the commission. You know, we have made equity a North Star for us as a legislative body. And I actually see, and maybe this is a good time to do some public advertising, we are hiring an equity coordinator at the council. So I think I don't think the Tax Revision Commission needs to reflect this priority. As well, I think we need to be for real here, so to speak. Let's look at who served in 6 of the 10 slots on the Tax Revision Commission last time. So you have 2 business lobbyists, 2 corporate lawyers, a self-described libertarian economist, and a millionaire businessman, and a partridge in a pear tree. No partridge in a pear tree. But, you know, no doubt, all 6 of these people know tax policy well. Of course, as someone else said, we've learned from the man hopefully who will be voted out as president very soon, that people with lots of money know how to manipulate the tax system very well, whereas working people have to pay their taxes. And so, but my point here is that this commission needs to reflect our community. And I don't think that the 2013 Tax Revision Commission, even though there were some very prominent and, you know, well-regarded people, I don't think it reflected our community. So, and I want to say, I always want to find common ground. So I agree with you and Councilmember Che that we need more information as a body to inform our choices on raising revenue and taxes. But I want to point out there is an alternative. The independent, nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office periodically provides Congress, our federal legislative body, with a report showing options for reforming the tax code. And the one from 2019 apparently runs over 100 pages long. We don't have the CBO, but change one letter, we have a CFO. We have an entire office at the Office of the Chief Financial Officer dedicated to tax analysis. And I'm really thrilled to see Ms. Taylor shaking her head here. I know she was a member of that office at one point. Why not have these very well-regarded professional economists provide this kind of analysis, do this examination of our tax code, and provide us a range of recommendations? You know, I think that would be a very good alternative. Or you can have the council's budget office tasked with this every council period. But let me be for real myself. I can see from the number of co-introducers and co-sponsors that my colleagues prefer a commission likely. So I want to make a few recommendations, that friendly recommendations, Mr. Chairman, I hope will be incorporated. The commission is making recommendations to the mayor and the entire council. So I do think the entire council should have a say in who sits on the commission. So right now, as I understand the legislation, the mayor and the chairman can appoint members of the commission without any council input. Considering how important this commission is, I mean, as another witness said, I mean, this will be creating the tax policy that will fund all of our programs. I hope we can at least have council approval incorporated into this legislation. You know, I'll just say, if we required a council vote for 2 appointments on the marijuana private club task force, I think we should at least require council approval for the Tax Revision Commission. 2 other recommendations. The commission should be subject to the Open Meetings Act, so the public always has a seat at the table. I think that should be a pretty easy and reasonable one. Finally, let me return to the issue of racial equity. I'm concerned that the directions given to the commission in the current legislation are limited to things like competitiveness and encouraging business growth. You know, we know that many tax changes can have a harmful or disproportionate effect on residents of color. So I hope in the final bill we can include language that also requires the commission to consider racial equity, not just equity for businesses. Mr. Chairman, I know that's taken up 6 of my 8 minutes. So let me just turn to, I'm trying to think how to do this. Well, let me turn to Ms. Taylor. What do you think about the idea of having the CFO perform this work instead of a commission?
I think it requires on the part of the council to ask questions about the economic impacts of tax policy as well as fiscal impacts. As you said, I've served in that office for 10 years. I have received many proposals from the council for scoring. Never single time asked the question, the bigger impacts, whether it's economic impacts or racial impacts, never has been asked. So it's up to the council to create that kind of discipline. The most important aspect of a tax revision commission, however you create it, can enforce that if you provide the guiding principles of what they should be caring about. But that requires on the part of the council to, with every tax proposal, ask the question of how does it impact the economy? What kind of racial equity impacts does it have? If you can do it, that's great.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor. I don't mean to be rude, but I only have 40 more seconds. Let me turn to Ms. Franco. Ms. Franco, congratulations on your new position. Do you think racial equity should be an important factor in this commission? And if so, how do you think it should be incorporated?
I mean, I don't know exactly how it should be incorporated, but it should be incorporated in everything we do in our lives, not only in the tax commission. And when you're looking at reestablishing a commission, you really need to make sure that all the voices are being heard. Everybody, somebody that cares about the, equity, racial, businesses, employment, and really hearing all voices, because sometimes what I see is that we are not looking at the big picture. We focus in what we care about. And I think that if we're gonna be working on these together, we really have to make sure that we're hearing all voices, including employees, including, people that are receiving services, including businesses, because businesses, businesses work very hard to get where they go, and really having a balanced group of voices that can chime in and share their own experience. And obviously equity for me is part of who I am.
Thank you, Ms. Franco. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the extra time. And thank you to all the witnesses who are testifying today.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Bonds, do you have any questions? And you're muted.
Oh, and if you
You're
don't
good.
mind, I'd like to say a few words. All right. Thank you very much for convening this very important hearing today. I'm proud to have co-introduced this Reestablishment Act with my other council members, Shay, Allen, Robert White, Todd, Evans, Grasso, and Nadeau. Because I believe then, and I still do now, it is essential for tax reform to be considered in a comprehensive manner. And now, because of the immediacy of the current economic downturn that much of the country, as well as the district, is experiencing because of the effects of the corona pandemic, I want to make a couple of points and then I'll turn very quickly to a few questions. Our jurisdiction is a small one, surrounded by 2 large states. We must strive to preserve and enhance our tax base to the greatest extent possible to provide the essential services to our citizens, while also not driving individual taxpayers away from the district. And with the ever looming threat of the reimposition of the control board, there is an extra layer of analysis and concern that is required for us as compared to other jurisdictions as we access local revenue and budgetary needs. And this has always been a difficult balancing act for the district's elected officials, but the tension that undergirds DC's finances has become significantly exacerbated by the COVID public health emergency. In fact, as of August, more than 33,000 of our friends and neighbors here in the district area are unemployed, and small businesses are failing at an alarming rate. There is a significant risk that 40% or more of the district's restaurants will close and we will never see them open again. I consider this a big emergency. And I say all of this to say, as we're talking about membership and we're talking about the goals of our community, I think it's time to, I'll quote Ms. Franco, and I like what you said. You said, let's round out the membership of this body. It is time to do that. We are one big, broad community, but whatever tax policies we put in place, they affect us all one way or the other. I think it's time to expand the membership of the commission to include our ANCs, our civic leaders, and rank and file community members. We should at least have representation from some of the most affected constituencies as to the decisions we make, like our seniors, our low-income residents, our renters, you know, and the diversity of the community. I know we all are talking equity, 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 but in my mind, as a Black woman, it is important for me to add to the conversation the fact that equity does in fact include us all. And there are clearly some parts of our community that are not represented as much as other parts of the community. We all know that. We see it each and every day. And so when we talk about how a commission as important as defining how much tax dollars and how we distribute the tax dollars, or what that distribution should be as we make the collections, I think is very important that we understand that we all have a role to play in this process and that we all should be included. And so I have a question as it relates to any members of the witnesses, really and truly. If the legislation is reenacted, that the commission is reconstituted, what are some of the specific issues you would like for the commission to begin examining right out the gate? And Ms. Taylor, I see you. I see Ms. Malloy. I see Ms. Franco. I see Mr. Schwartzman, Ms. Mitchell, Mr. Lazar. And of course, I see my good friend Kashini.
I'll start. One thing that was missing in the last tax revision commission's work were specific proposals about real property taxes. And some of the members of this panel mentioned the need to increase income taxes to address some of the racial inequity issues. I think it's worth reminding ourselves that a large part of the gap in wealth is due to our ability to buy a house versus not buy a house. And that wealth built in housing is really important. I haven't heard anyone talk about proposals that taxes wealth as opposed to taxes income. And that's one opportunity that the last tax revision commission did not really take into consideration. But importantly, I do agree with one of the other panelists that the expenditure side should be in our minds while looking at revenue sources. And we have certain needs we want to meet, and the goal has to be creating those resources with as little economic disincentives as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, Mr. Schwartzman?
Yes, thanks for the question. I think that the council needs to act as I indicated in my testimony, and they need to act now to make our tax structure more progressive and recover needed revenue in this deep crisis. But that action should inform, if there is another tax revision commission, that action should inform the commission in its approach. And I'm happy to hear a suggestion of a wealth tax, indeed, but that certainly should be applied. But I put in the chat, Council Member Bonds.
I saw it. I read it.
You told me at Christmas at the Metro Council AFL-CIO that you like the idea of recovering the Trump tax cut that wealthy people are getting. And I hope you can support that now, because this is a very large amount of revenue that we desperately need to, and it would leave these taxpayers in this, basically in the same position they were before the Trump tax legislation was passed. I think it's an eminently fair approach, and raising the top rates a few percent would be consistent with this approach. But thank you again for that question.
Thank you. Ms. Landfield, I see your hand and you have a few seconds.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that there are so many important good things that the Tax Commission could discuss, but that's really for several years down the line. We need action now. Our families cannot afford to wait. We have ideas. We have research. We have examples in other states and cities. We need action pretty much immediately. And the Tax Commission, there's no way that we can get it that quickly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Bonds.
I'm out of town. Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you.
So I have a few questions. I have to say that I'm actually shocked by the testimony in opposition, because the council has adopted a tax revision commission 3 times in the past, and now those commissions have issued reports that were quite in-depth and were useful to the council, even if not all of those recommendations were adopted. The recommendations from 2000 to 2013 commission were actually mostly implemented by the council, and as a result, the council received considerable praise for making structural changes to our tax structure that were perceived as being far more fair than they had been. And so I think what I'm hearing from some witnesses is that no, let's not go forward with study. Let's raise taxes now. David Schwartzman, would that be a fair representation of your view?
Well, let me put a little caveat on that.
Well, not too long, but please.
No, very briefly. I did testify against the convening of Tax Revision Commission because of the fear that this would be delay action by the council, as Catherine just pointed out. Now, if the council acts to recover the Trump tax cut and really implement some really progressive revenue approaches, then sure, I would support another commission, but again, along the lines that Councilmember Silverman and Councilmember Barnes have indicated. Thank you.
But and what I hear is you know the answer. We need to raise certain taxes. Maybe even you know the answer. We need to know exactly how much to raise the taxes. The council should act now to raise the taxes and not do this commission. Fine, study it after we raise the taxes, but don't study it before we raise the taxes. The second question I have, and I think I'll direct this to Ms. Ludwig, is several witnesses talked about fair share. I think you talked about fair share. What is fair share? I agree that people should pay their fair share. Can you quantify that?
Chairman Mendelson, that is clearly a subjective view. There is no authority from on high that's going to define that. You know very well, as do I, that that is a political question. And it's exactly because it is a political question that we think it is appropriate for elected representatives on the council to balance those political considerations. We can't pretend that tax policy is some kind of, it's not like biology and chemistry. So rather than pretending that some experts can make the final judgment, I'm very much in support of experts providing the data and suggesting the policy options. But in the end, it's going to have to be, it should be our elected representatives, the DC Council, to actually weigh those political considerations and make those decisions. At least that's the way I see it.
Well, I appreciate that answer. And I agree with you that in the end, it is the council. And that actually was kind of shocking to me as well, when one of the witnesses, at least one of the witnesses, testified about how, well, the council shouldn't delegate to the commission. But in reality, it's up to the council whether we adopt the recommendation. So we don't delegate any decision making. And so consistent with what you're saying, Ms. Ludwig, yeah, there's some value to studying and kind of looking at the options and figuring out what is a fair share for the council to make a more informed decision. It is the council's decision. But so this leads to my next question, which is, what I've heard and what several people have talked about seems to me to beg for the kind of analysis or study that a commission does. You know, this was the 98 commission, this was the 2010 commission. I have upstairs the 1978 commission, where they looked at these questions. So those folks who are testifying against a commission, against a study, but they say we should raise the tax on the highest, your income earners. I don't disagree, or I could put that differently. I agree that the highest wage earners, the most profitable businesses, should pay a greater percentage of their income than those at the low end. But how much do we raise? There was some testimony about how we should be raising taxes so that we can fund all programs. Meet the needs, meet all of the needs, especially of our neediest residents. So how much do we raise taxes? Is competitiveness not an issue at all? I was kind of shocked at the Fiscal Policy Institute statement that the primary goal of revenue policy is to raise enough revenue to meet the critical needs of DC residents. Nothing said about competitiveness or even fairness or proportionality, or what the appropriate limits are. So let me ask this of Ms. Mitchell from the Fiscal Policy Institute. Is there not a value? Should we not study what is fair, or how much would be raising the tax on the highest? Or is there a limit to the proposition that we fund all programs or look at competitiveness? Ms. Mitchell, you were opposed to the commission. why should we not be trying to answer those questions?
Thank you for giving me the chance to respond. That's actually not an accurate reflection of what my testimony said. I said that our primary goal is to fund critical needs and to invest in the building blocks of a strong economy. And a core guiding principle should always be equity and fairness. And to me, that means asking more from those who have the greatest ability to give. And Chairman, you often cite ITEP data when you talk about how people in our bottom fifth pay lower taxes as a share of their total income than people at the top. So I think that you already have a good sense of what equity means. But if you look at that same chart, it shows that the top earners are paying higher.
Ms. Mitchell, first of all, you are misstating what you testified to. I read the primary quote, the primary goal of revenue policy is to raise enough revenue to meet the critical needs of DC residents. And later you said, we focus more on principles that advance adequacy, inclusive economic growth, and racial equity, and you ad-libbed added, rather than focus on competitiveness. And my question to you is, should we not be studying these issues, such as what is fair share that Ms. Lidowahedi said is a subjective question? Or should we not be looking at how much? Is there a limit to how much we raised? Aren't there other factors like competitiveness? Should we not be studying those things? That's my question to you.
We should absolutely be studying those things. And I will just say again, in the very same sentence that I said that we should make sure that our tax policy raises enough, we should do it in an equitable way. I have been very consistent about that, and so has DCFPI. I think that with respect to the last commission, I think that it definitely
Ms. Mitchell, that was not your statement. Sorry to interrupt, but that was not your statement. I'll read the full sentence. Quote, the primary goal of revenue policy is to raise enough revenue to meet the critical needs of DC residents. And a guiding principle is to do so in a way that asks more from those with the greatest ability to contribute. Period. End of quote.
That means equity, Chairman. Asking those with the greatest ability to give to DCFPI means equity. I think if I could answer your question about competitiveness, I would like to. If I had the opportunity. I think that the principles that guided the previous tax commission's work provided unwarranted attention on maintaining competitiveness, and then it ignored some information about research. It ignored some research about competitiveness. For example, the example that I gave was around the franchise tax. The commission was presented with evidence that DC was already outperforming surrounding jurisdictions in business and job growth in the last decade, despite having a higher corporate income tax, and they still recommended it to be lower. And not only did they recommend the franchise tax to be lower, they tax business income at a lower rate than moderate income residents' income in DC. Now, I think that there are
I'm over my time, so I need you to summarize.
I think we can all agree that somebody earning $60,000 in taxable income should not pay the same tax rate as somebody earning $350,000, or barely a tax rate that's lower than a millionaire's tax rate. I think we can all agree that that's not fair, and that that is not guided by data-driven, evidence-based research.
So why don't we lower that rate?
A recommendation about the Council Budget Office being a good resource for regular, ongoing tax recommendations.
I'm over my time. I want to thank each of you for your testimony. I'm just checking to see if there are any council members, other council members. I want to thank each of you for your testimony. The record is open for another 2 weeks. Let me turn now to the next panel. So again, thank you, each of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Zachary Teutsch or Tutsch, who's listed as a public witness. Stephanie Sneed, who's the executive director of the Fair Budget Coalition. Kamalika Das, who's a policy analyst with the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. Joanna Blotner, who is the legislative director of Jews United for Justice. Amber Harding, who is an attorney with the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless. Otis Pitney, who is listed as a public witness. Emma West Rasmus, who's a member of Resource Generation. James Nash, listed as a public witness. Kitty Richards, who is strategic advisor at Groundwork Collaborative. Brett Davis, who is pastor at Georgetown Lutheran Church. And Jesse Rabinowitz, who is with Miriam's Kitchen. Let me just double check with staff, see if everybody's been let in. Well, let's begin with Mr., I don't know how to pronounce your last name, Teutsch?
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. In 3 minutes, please.
Council members Mendelson, Bond, Silverman, and Pinto, it's an honor to be with you today. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I urge you to oppose Bill 23-316. The intent is good, but the mechanics will weaken the council and undermine democratic accountability. Like other jurisdictions, DC has many incongruities in its tax and revenue system, and there are many opportunities to make it more effective and efficient. We should fix the incongruities and pursue opportunities to improve. We should create a more graduated income tax bracket system. We should fix loopholes that undermine our intent on estate taxes and many other specific revenue mechanisms. We should evaluate these issues, study them, and identify solutions. The right mechanism is for the council itself to directly oversee and operate the process, including identifying the questions, directing the research into them, developing the proposals, evaluating them, debating them, and voting on them. Outsourcing the responsibility for directing the research and making the proposals would weaken the council in the most critical areas: revenue, finance, and tax. As council members, you speak with voters on a daily basis and are accountable to them. And that is precisely why you should own all aspects of the process concerning the hardest decisions. You need resources to revise the system. By adding a policy research arm to the council, as most other major cities and states have, we will add policy-focused staff. That staff will add the capacity needed to address these issues internally council. And as a result, DC would then have the internal bandwidth so that on an ongoing basis, as urgent matters arise and the federal tax law changes, we'll be able to make the local changes to avoid inefficiencies that create bad outcomes for DC. We're in the midst of a critical moment, and we need the expertise in-house for moments precisely like this one. We can begin now to build that internal bandwidth rather than outsourcing. Many stakeholders have useful information to contribute to the process. If business people want to participate, they can lobby as they already do, testify as they already do, and share proposals. Policy experts will do the same, as can members of nonprofits and other local organizations. Elected officials have a responsibility and unique ability to adjudicate between these perspectives. Many of you chose to support this commission when there was less to address the issue. There's great changing one's view when the world changes. The pandemic has made this matter critical in a way none of us anticipated in 2019. So we should add internal bandwidth so that we can address these issues more effectively, expediently, and accountably than we could with an outsourced solution like the TRC. I have spoken with thousands of voters in 2020, and the campaign I chair for Janice Lewis George has had over 100,000 voter contacts. Every single voter who shared a concern about taxes, worried that our rates were not sufficiently progressive. Few, if any, of the people who served on the original Tax Review Commission, before which I testified, have a velocity of conversations with voters anything like what each of you has. Councilmember Pinto, I recall reading about your campaign and just how active you were in reaching out to the voters in Ward 2, calling dozens or even more than 100 per day. You learned from them, and that was a critical experience. People who have had those conversations should be the ones to direct the research, make the proposals, and make the decisions on these kinds of critical issues. When important work is done by people who are accountable to the voters, democracy is strengthened. When that work is outsourced to people who don't face the voters.
Can you conclude?
Yes, I have just one more sentence, Mr. Chairman. When that work is outsourced to people who don't face voters, democracy is weakened. I ask you to strengthen democracy and prevent the weakening of the council.
Thank you, Mr. Teich. We do not have a copy of your statement. So if you would be sure to provide that.
Yes, I just shared a link so that everybody would have it to all panelists in the form of a Google Doc. Has it come through, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, my staff tells me we just got it.
Thank you so much.
Stephanie Sneed, who's Executive Director with the Fair Budget Coalition.
Good morning, Chairman Mendelson and other members of the council. My name is Stephanie Sneed. I'm the Executive Director of the Fair Budget Coalition. While usually at this time of year, we're spending our time planning our annual budget recommendations that come out in February, today I wanted to come and stand with our members and colleagues in opposition to the formation of a tax revision commission. Over the weekend, the number 750 reverberated all over the news cycle, on social media and conversations. $750, the dollar amount that the New York Times discovered President Trump paid on his federal taxes in 2016 and 2017. While many people reeled in disgust, to most people in my respective communities, this information only reaffirmed what we already knew. Our tax structure privileges the wealthy and harms middle-class and low-income families and communities. Wealthy people are able to abuse and take advantage of our flawed tax code, and it is not just President Trump. It is also people like our neighbor Jeff Bezos and numerous other wealthy citizens who are able to escape paying what is their fair share of the economy. For too long, our tax structure has been built on the literal backs of Black, immigrant, and low-income communities. While there's a time and a place for strategic planning, slow implementation, and thoughtful debate, this is not that time. A new tax commission would only serve to delay what has been meaningful movement towards progressive tax reform. And maybe that's the point. We've seen incredible work by Councilmember Charles Allen, Councilmember Trayon White, and Councilmember Brianna Doe, and we believe this work should be continued. The council can and should take on this role. You already hold the role of managing the budget. This should be part of that work. In 2013, when the last tax commission was convened, despite progressive recommendations being made, the council did not implement all of those recommendations. The council disproportionately left ideas on the table that would have benefited low-income Black and brown residents. We can't go down that path again. We don't have 2 years to wait on recommendations. This is something that should be handled through annual revenue hearings and through regular engagement on ongoing tax policy review. We are in the midst of an economic recession, and we must resist the calls for austerity and cuts made to our most critical services. Our tax structure needs to change now. We have urgent needs which require action. A tax commission would delay this work. Wealthy DC residents have received extreme federal tax cuts, and the district should be able to work to recoup some of those to benefit our residents who deserve more from this city. The tax changes our coalition has advocated for are moderate, but the needs are great. We have to work together to make tax changes now, as revenues are falling and our communities need more. We see how much low-income families in DC have been harmed and are struggling to survive. Those families who are on the brink are now on full-on crisis. Just tax policy can help district residents to mitigate the harm of the recession and reverse course. Only with political will can we see this council uplift the values that they have purported. Tax policy can and should be a tool for racial justice and equity. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Ms. Sneed. Ms. Das?
Thank you for the opportunity to submit testimony. My name is Kamalika Das. I'm a Ward 3 resident, and I represent the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that analyzes the effects of federal, state, and local tax policies. I'm here today to, 1, encourage the DC Council to efficiently adopt shovel-ready, progressive, revenue-raising tax policies and not delay these necessary tax changes through another time-intensive tax revision commission process. 2, to clarify that clear tax policy solutions to achieve a more adequate and equitable tax system have already been identified through past efforts, and some don't require further study. And 3, allay any concerns about the unintended consequences of increasing taxes for high-income earners. We do not need more studies to determine that top earners in DC continue to pay a proportionately smaller share of their income on total local taxes compared to the middle class, and that raising taxes on the wealthy is appropriate at a time when half of DC children in renter households are not getting enough to eat, but top earners are less likely to have been laid off, and many have actually seen their disposable incomes increase during this pandemic. Secondly, the DC Council already has a long list of known solutions and policy levers. The last commission held over 24 meetings, 3 public hearings to assess various policy ideas, many of which ITEP was a part of. Some of these ideas were adopted, others are still available for the council to act on. Council can create more progressive brackets at the top, cap the maximum itemized deductions that a taxpayer can claim, reinstate the $2 million estate tax exemption from 2017. As David Schwartzman said, other states have already taken the lead on increasing taxes on top earners to address critical needs. New Jersey will raise $390 million by increasing the tax rate on incomes of more than 1 million from 8.97% to 10.75%. California, New York, Rhode Island have also proposed similar measures. There are ballot initiatives in Illinois and Arizona for higher taxes on the state's richest residents. Contrary to one-off anecdotes, media headlines, and quote-unquote research bankrolled by the Koch brothers, there's no evidence that taxing high-income earners hinders economic growth or causes tax flight. I can send you a number of these research pieces if you'd like. Recent IRS data shows that fears about competitiveness and tax flight are unfounded. Many claimed that capping the state and local tax deduction at 10 grand per year would cause high earner migration, but recent IRS data reveals exactly the opposite. States with higher income or property taxes, such as California, New York, New Jersey, have actually seen more growth in millionaire tax returns in the last 2 years compared to other states. We should also keep in mind that top earners in DC are already paying less tax than prior to the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. In 2020, the top 1% will receive an average $54,000 tax cut, and the top 5% will get about $13,400. Low and middle income residents are far more likely to flee DC than high earners because DC has not sufficiently invested in programs and services that keep it affordable. So DC has the opportunity to make these investments now with or without a new tax revision commission. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Doss. Ms. Blattner.
Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to testify. My name is Joanna Blattner, and I am testifying on behalf of Jews United for Justice. For more than 2 decades, JUFJ has worked to advance economic, racial, and social justice in Washington, D.C. by mobilizing the local Jewish community to action. And now is a time for action and for policies to ensure that our city's values and mottos are reflected. Justice to all. This past Monday, Jews around the world observed Yom Kippur. Some may know this holiday as a day of fasting and atonement. This is not simply a day of atonement for spiritual or religious transgressions. Rather, the holiday is a collective repentance for the ways in which we have all individually and societally caused harm to one another, failing to keep a social covenant that guarantees compassion, dignity, and justice to all. The words we read each Yom Kippur from the biblical book of Isaiah speak to the core of this holiday. I will abbreviate just to say, the fast that is required of us is to remove the shackles of the oppressed, to feed the hungry, to house the poor and the homeless, and to not turn away the neighbor or the stranger in our midst. This year, these words weigh heavier on my heart than usual. Here in DC, we have failed to fully house and feed those in need in our most prosperous times. And now, with nearly $1 billion in revenue loss, a looming unemployment and insurance and eviction crisis, and a national reckoning with racial inequality, this council is kicking the can down the road once again by debating the merits of a tax commission. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of residents are panicking about how to pay tomorrow's rent. Having served on the city's Jobs, Wages, and Benefits Task Force in 2016, I fear the repetition of another lengthy, undemocratic, drawn-out process when it comes to tax policies, especially heading into a recession which demands nimble policy making. A tax revision commission is the wrong vehicle for our city. In fact, it is worth noting yet again that this bill was introduced last year in a time of prosperity and budget surpluses and did not, nor could not, imagine in any way the situation we now find ourselves in. For these reasons, JUFJ opposes the reestablishment of the Tax Revision Commission. And instead, we call on our elected leaders to act with alacrity and moral conviction to prioritize our DC residents who are suffering most acutely from the effects of this pandemic. This means acting to prevent core cuts to budget services, and it means putting more revenue on the table to raise taxes and meet our existing and our growing needs. The data is clear. It is time to ask more of our wealthiest residents. That is not to say that more analysis and updates to our tax codes are not needed. They are, and we have heard many proposals already today to that point. JUFJ supports those. Taxes and budgets are fundamentally moral issues. Both our budget actions and our inactions speak volumes about our values. Let's not let another year go by before we make amends for the harm we have done by failing to ensure racial and economic justice to all.
Thank you, Ms. Blattner. Ms. Harding, good morning.
Morning. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Amber Harding, and I'm an attorney at the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, where we envision a just and inclusive community for all residents of DC, where housing is a human right, and where every individual and family has equal access to the resources they need to thrive. Because these core elements of our mission depend on having sufficient revenue as a city to support life-saving programs, we have been actively engaged in DC tax policy for decades. There's nothing objectionable on its face about a bill that restarts the Tax Revision Commission. This bill was introduced in 2019, back when the council was rethinking how wise it was to have one council member chair a committee that controlled tax policy, particularly when it turned out that council member was engaging in questionable ethical behavior. The economy was good, even if income inequality was getting worse. Tax policy is often viewed as complicated and wonky, and looking to a group of experts to provide recommendations and guidance made some sense abstractly. No one was anticipating a global pandemic and the worst recession we have ever experienced, but that is the crux of the problem with this bill. Tax policy shouldn't be developed once a decade, divorced from assessments about whether there is enough revenue to meet the pressing needs of DC residents. Tax policy should not exist in a vacuum, and tax proposals will be urgently needed before a commission can make its recommendations. When the council decides to lift the eviction moratorium, what will it do to respond to the resulting tsunami of evictions? Will it throw its hands up and say there just isn't enough revenue to provide eviction prevention funds? That's penny wise, pound foolish. Even if the council is inured to the pain and trauma of eviction, surely it knows that homelessness costs more than housing. Or will the council say they can't act to increase revenue to prevent those thousands of evictions because they are waiting for the commission to make recommendations? Those recommendations will come too late for thousands of DC residents. Because of the real life consequences of decisions, tax policy is also not something that should be developed behind closed doors by a group of people that by definition, having been appointed by the mayor and the chair, already have more access to elected leaders than the average DC resident. Tax policy should not be esoteric and elite. It should be grounded in real needs and accessible to those who pay the taxes. Tax policy should be discussed openly and publicly, with opportunities for all DC residents to testify in support of or opposition to specific proposals. While the last Tax Review Commission held some general public input sessions, they were not as accessible as public hearings. There is no legislative record. And there's no opportunity to provide support or opposition to specific proposals. Instead, the recommendations of the commission came out, and several of their recommendations made it into annual budgets without any opportunity for public hearing or vetting on their particulars. This council should be committed to exploring ways to be more democratic in its procedures and decision-making, not less. That's not to say expertise and research play no part in developing tax policy. They do, but not to the exclusion of taxpayers. We support adding staff to the budget office to provide technical assistance, and at the hearings on the various bills, those tax experts that would be appointed to the commission can testify publicly. And I will wrap up. I see I'm over my time. We agree that we need a better process for vetting tax policy, and that leaving it to the final hours of the budget season is not ideal. And that's why we recommended last year that we have hearings at the beginning of the budget process on all the tax proposals so that you could get that kind of public vetting on specifics. And to your question of like which tax rate is fair, that's what the public hearing process does. It allows all the people who have expertise, personal or professional, to come forward and say whether it's fair. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Harding. The next witness is Otis Pitney.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here today. Thank you, Chairman Mendelson, for the opportunity to testify. My name is Otis Pitney. I'm here on behalf of myself and as a member of Resource Generation DC. Resource Generation is a multiracial group of young people with wealth and class privilege that are committed to equity and wealth distribution. You'll hear more about resource generation from the next speaker, but as for me, I'm here today as someone who was a high income earner to oppose the reestablishment of the Tax Revision Commission and to urge the council to raise taxes on DC's wealthiest residents. I oppose the reestablishment of the tax revision based on the understanding that its creation would delay the process of raising taxes on the wealthy and ultimately seek to create a balanced solution among constituents that are very deeply imbalanced in their economic fortunes and power. In my mind, the need for more revenue at this time is very clear, and it makes sense to ask those that have done extremely well to provide funding to get us through this and out the other side better than how we came in. I think bold tax action is necessary to help correct historical patterns of systemic inequality, and believe that while the need for this action has always been there, there may now be enough broad support, particularly among wealthy residents, to get something big and bold achieved. Between the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 and the uprising for racial justice in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, there have been equity conversations in all kinds of places and social circles where they would not have happened before. There are Black Lives Matter signs on every block in DC's most affluent neighborhoods. I attended Sidwell Friends for high school and come from a privileged family background of generational wealth. Until recently, I worked at an investment bank where I was making high income earner wages. And in the social circles that I'm a part of with this background, the nature of the conversation is different now than it was before. Racial justice is on the map among both younger and older generations. My parents continue to live in the district and have come to the view that they should be paying higher taxes during this time and beyond. Leadership from the council to direct this energy is what is required at this moment. While the groundwork of new values and awareness may be laid, bold action will not happen without strong council leadership. When I was making a high earner income, I did not have time to care about what happened in local government. I passively supported racial justice, but would not have appeared to take a stand on tax process. As a passive supporter, I certainly would not have cared had my taxes risen in the interest of racial equity. And frankly, I'm not sure I would have noticed at the latest high income earner tax increase. I most certainly would not have even considered moving or changing anything else in my life. In DC, we have the second highest number of millionaires of any state in the country living right here in the district. I am not a tax policy expert and am not clear on what powers DC has versus the federal government, but what I'm interested in as a young wealthy person is how we tax wealth rather than income in finding the resources that we need. We have abundance of resources sitting idle with people who would be willing and indeed enthusiastic to provide funding. People want to live in equitable communities. They are better, more vibrant places to live. Equity makes a community more, not less competitive. And this is what we have as a collective action problem that the council can solve, and we ought to strive to create a wealth tax that can serve as a model for the rest of the country. Thank you.
Sorry for the delay, unmuting myself. Thank you, Mr. Pitney. Ms. West, I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name. West Rasmus?
West Rasmus, yes.
My apologies. Please proceed.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the members of this committee. My name is Emma West Rasmus. I'm a DC resident from Ward 1, and I'm testifying on behalf of Resource Generation DC and the 50 dues-paying members and hundreds more actively engaged in our work across the district. As the previous witness mentioned, Resource Generation is a multiracial membership coalition of young people ages 18 to 35 with wealth and class privilege committed to the equitable distribution of wealth, land, and power. We are committed to ensuring that the greatest and most unjust inequality in human history ends with our generation. I'm here to express our opposition to the tax commission. It is simply not the urgent solution that we need to address the current budget crisis. So why do we oppose the creation of the tax commission? The tax commission, established in 2011, took multiple years to advance policy changes. We simply do not have time on our side during this recession. We need more urgent solutions that will provide relief as quickly as possible. And this will be how we put people first and get our economy back on track. What do we support instead? We agree that regular, holistic, comprehensive, expert-led reviews of current DC tax policy are essential. As opposed to a commission, the district needs that role to be held by more neutral and expert analysts. We support the creation of a new, independent, nonpartisan position within the council budget office to conduct tax expenditure reviews and data-driven policy analyses. We also support increasing taxes on residents with wealth and high incomes, as well as on businesses that are still thriving. The members of Resource Generation, myself, we are included in this population, and we firmly stand in support of building greater tax equity into our system. We want to be paying more to support the needs of our community, and the council should act with urgency to advance economic justice in our tax code. To conclude, we all know we are facing unprecedented rates of job, housing, food insecurity in our community. Even before the coronavirus, we were facing a deeply rigged and unjust economy. The racial wealth gap in DC is staggering, with white families holding 81 times the median household wealth of Black families, according to a 2013 Urban Institute study. And it seems likely that that gap has only gotten worse given the state of income inequality in DC. The only way we are going to meet the needs of all DC residents is by putting new revenue on the table. We must not delay strategic, urgent action to create just recoveries, and we oppose the creation of the Tax Revision Commission and know that raising revenue and addressing current DC tax policy in an urgent, neutral, expert way is really what this moment calls for. Thank you so much for this chance to speak with you today.
Oh, thank you, Ms. West Rasmus. Mr. James Nash.
Good morning, council members. My name is James Nash, and I speak as a taxpayer who lives in Ward 4 and as a parishioner of St. Matthew's Cathedral, where I have served in our homeless ministries program for many years. I'm opposed to Bill 23-316 primarily because I fear the Tax Revision Commission will delay or prevent what is most critical for the health of our community. That is, raising taxes on the wealthier members of our community so our city has the money to help those who are poorest. I say this as a person who is relatively well off. Please raise my taxes so that we can end chronic homelessness and offer assistance to the many DC residents who are now struggling because of the pandemic. The need is critical and urgent. I see it every Monday in the faces of the people we are serving at St. Matthew's. And I take this position because of my Christian faith and because it is necessary to preserve my humanity when confronted with the overwhelming needs of the people we serve. It is emotionally and morally taxing, pun intended, to live in a city like this with so much wealth disparity. And I want to say this to you, Chairman Phil Mendelson, in particular, because you've raised the issue of competitiveness. If there's one thing that's going to make me leave this city, it's if you do not raise my taxes and do not deal with the unbelievable injustice that I see every day in our city. That's what's going to make me leave. I also take this position because there's plenty of evidence that ending chronic homelessness will actually save the city money in the long run. To do that, we need more money right now. A TRC filled with self-interested partisans, however, is unlikely to be open to this evidence. Instead, I believe the city should review its tax policy regularly with the aid of independent, nonpartisan analysts who can make reasonable, evidence-based recommendations that will restore equity to our tax system, preserve our city's fiscal integrity, and address the fallout from the pandemic. We are facing big increases in unemployment, mass evictions, and therefore big increases in our homeless population. We need to be ready for bold, swift, and smart responses to these many problems. And I'll say this one more time. Please raise my taxes to help the most vulnerable members of our community. Do not plug up our system with needless commissions. Thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Nash. Ms. Richards.
Thank you very much. It's nice to see you, Chairman Mendelson, Councilmember Silverman, Councilmember Pinto, Councilmember Bonds, Councilmember Che. I'm mostly known around here as a DC Council staffer and former acting executive director of the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, but I've more recently returned to my prior life as a primarily federal and state tax and fiscal policy expert, and I'm here in that capacity. As a tax nerd, I would usually be thrilled about the idea of a commission devoted to just rethinking tax policy, but I'm here to echo comments made by the vast majority of witnesses today to say that a tax commission is not the route to sound tax policy for DC. First, you cannot disconnect revenues from spending at the state and local level. We don't run structural deficits. We don't print our own currency. We have taxes because we need to fund all of the critical services and infrastructure that underlie a thriving community. You just cannot consider tax policy in a vacuum, and it's a mistake to sever these two things. Second, the decisions that you currently face are just not technocratic and amenable to a technocratic approach. When they're complicated, there are dozens of genuine experts in DC and across the country who are eager to advise you. I'm thrilled to see Ms. Das here from ITEP, which advises states across the country with cutting edge research and data analysis that they keep up to date every day of every year. But to be frank, the tax policy questions that you're facing are not particularly esoteric. They're fundamental political and deeply moral choices. What is fair? Whose needs should we prioritize? These choices should be made through public deliberation by well-informed elected officials. I've heard a number of talking points today about reaching consensus, but there is broad consensus among DC residents. They support higher taxes, especially on the wealthy, to pay for critical services. That is the consensus among voters. It's also the consensus among mainstream economists, especially during the current crisis. Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz and I wrote a piece in the New York Times a few weeks ago about exactly this topic. Councilmember Bonds, I too am deeply concerned about the economic calamity that you described, and we can't solve it without spending significant resources, which, because of balanced budget requirements, means raising revenue. John Bates Clark Medal winner Emmanuel Saez has joined in the calls, as has Jared Bernstein, a key advisor to Vice President Biden. There's been talk about competitiveness. If you're curious about millionaire migration, I can connect you with Cornell's Christopher Young, who literally wrote the book on that myth. These experts have studied these issues for their entire careers, and they are all fighting for increased taxes on the wealthy at the state and local level right now. We have democratic consensus and we have expert consensus. What we need is political will. I will say that I strongly support additional expert staff in the Council Budget Office and annual revenue hearings as part of the budget process. Currently, DC Council is completely at the mercy of the mayor. I used to work on the House Budget Committee at the federal level. It's the first step in the congressional budget process, which kicks off by receiving the president's budget and then completely reallocating among taxes and spending, setting revenue targets and spending targets, issuing reconciliation instructions to all of the other committees to ensure that those targets are met. They don't just take the president's budget at face value and start nibbling around the edges. And I'd really encourage the council to take a more robust role in the big important decisions about budgeting. If you do go forward with a commission, I would make a few suggestions. First, as has been said many times, it should represent the broad swath of DC residents who are deeply concerned about inequality, cost of living, and quality of life, not a small group of folks heavily tilted toward business interests. Second, it should be staffed by mainstream progressive tax policy experts. And third, it should have clear mandates to assemble research and create proposals for consideration, not make decisions, to address specific measurable issues, not just talk of competitiveness or talk of equity. We need to say, what is your proposal to reduce inequality in this city? What is your proposal to reduce the racial wealth gap in this city? Those are measurable concepts that we need to be focused on, and we need to be focused on the needs of DC residents.
Thank you, Ms. Richards. I'll let you go on a little bit. I'm disadvantaged in that I don't believe we have a copy of your statement. If you would provide that, and you mentioned this article that you wrote, I'd be interested in seeing that you said you wrote for the New York Times.
Yeah, happy to.
If you could provide that, I'd appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Brett Davis.
Yes,
Good morning, Chairman Mendelson and committee. I'm the Reverend Brett Davis, and I serve as pastor of Georgetown Lutheran Church. I'm a board member of the Georgetown Ministry Center that provides homeless services, and I live in Ward 3. I speak as a public citizen and as clergy because budgets are moral documents, and tax policies and study processes that are often seen as high-level administrative conversations actually affect those who are most in need. I understand the spirit of the proposed reestablishment of the TRC, but I question its timing. And I stand with other witnesses today who speak against its passing, so as to encourage the council and our mayor's office to focus on urgent matters. Long-term planning and strategic assessment is great, something we all aspire to, a function of healthy governments and organizations. However, my concern about restarting an open-ended, primarily closed-door commission appointed, not with public hearings, is that concerned citizens and new proposals for tax policy will be deferred or just told, we're studying that, without transparency, public hearings, and attention to the urgency that this moment clearly demands. Even some of the revenue ideas that were raised in the last question and answer period need examining now, not referral to a committee to return with answers in a couple of years. From my perspective as a pastor, even in Georgetown, it is impossible to ignore the impact of the pandemic and the need for responsive, flexible action from our council and a tax policy that puts people first. There is a dramatic difference between what my work looks like pre and now during COVID-19, and so should our leadership, budgeting, and tax review processes. I spend more and more time each week responding to needs like folks who are newly unemployed, church members unable to make rent payments, friends who are unhoused DC residents feeling even more stressed and traumatized. For me, campus ministry at Georgetown and GW now looks like providing groceries to students who are living and working minimum wage jobs here in DC, because that's the only way they can afford to study. For my neighbors in Georgetown and Glover Park, most of our lives remain comfortable. I hear from these folks a sense of powerlessness, not about long-range planning and big questions, but about how to help now, about what our city is doing now. We want to hear about revenue and resource solutions. I believe that city residents know this urgency and would see the appointment of a TRC as tone deaf to the urgent needs we see around us. I would happily support a tax raise for myself and creative revenue solutions being discussed to care for the vulnerable among us. Churches and nonprofit organizations in DC have been amazing. Our city has responded to the needs we see, and organizations have pivoted budgets, staff time, and resources to meet these new needs. I commend the ways in which we have done this, and I hope our council will continue to examine it, not send it to a closed-door committee. I want a transparent, nimble tax budgeting conversation to bring the people most vulnerable to the table, to open up more and more public hearings like this. And I thank you for the time to answer and to speak on these issues, because a closed-door commission charged to study and make recommendations on an unclear timeline is not the answer I need right now for the folks that I work with every day. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Reverend. And Jesse Rabinowitz.
Hi there, Chairperson Mendelson and members of the committee. My name is Jesse Rabinowitz, and I am the Advocacy and Campaign Manager at Miriam's Kitchen, where we work to end chronic homelessness. I'm testifying today about the connection between creating a more equitable tax structure and creating a DC where everyone has access to the housing and other resources they need to thrive. During the last budget season, many council members advised waiting until fall to better understand the economic harm of COVID-19 on DC's economy. I see little measurable indication that DC's residents are doing better now than in July. In fact, Miriam's Kitchen is serving on average 100 more meals a day than during the start of the pandemic, indicating an increase in poverty, food scarcity, and homelessness. Now that fall is here, it's time to stick to your commitments and take decisive action by putting real revenue-raising options on the table. Failure to act now is a tacit endorsement of the status quo of continued gentrification, displacement, hunger, and educational divides. Our clients at Miriam's Kitchen living outside don't need a commission, they need housing. This housing can be funded now through bold, progressive fiscal policies. A sole focus on bringing back the Tax Revision Commission at this time is ill-advised. DC's most recent tax revision took 2 years to complete, and still the council ignored many of the bold changes proposed. In times of crisis, we need action, not white papers. Just like the newly formed police commission did not stop NPD from murdering Dion K, the Tax Revision Commission simply cannot act with the urgency needed to address the human distress fueled by COVID-19. I urge the council to listen to the many experts testifying today and to respect the will of DC voters who overwhelmingly support raising taxes on our wealthiest residents to meet DC's pressing needs. We are standing on the shore watching a tidal wave form. The solution is to get to higher ground as quickly as possible, not form a commission to discuss possible exit routes. Reevaluating our tax structure to ensure that our wealthiest neighbors and businesses pay their fair share is both essential to meeting basic human needs and crucial for achieving justice. In a city and country founded on, buttressed by, and still upholding a system of white racialized capitalism, we cannot separate fiscal policy from equity. You simply cannot champion ending homelessness and other justice issues while continuing to uphold the tax and economic system that privileges the few over the many. This council continues to lift up racial equity as a guiding value. Unless this commitment is matched with fundamentally restructuring and redistributing wealth in DC, this commitment to equity will be like Black Lives Matter painted on 16th Street, performative and symbolic, but devoid of any meaningful change. Progressive taxation can shrink the racialized income gap that allows some DC residents to own mansions and second homes while thousands of people sleep without roofs over their head. Moreover, the implications for a wealth gap have negative results for democracy, community, safety, and continue to exacerbate DC's racialized caste system. By shrinking income disparities and creating a just tax structure, you can catalyze recovery and create opportunities for all of our neighbors. Nearly every day for the past 6 years, I talk to people experiencing homelessness who are rightly frustrated by the lack of housing juxtaposed to massive increase in development and wealth. These clients are overwhelmingly Black and older and cannot understand why a city with so much wealth and self-proclaimed progressive leaders chooses to allow homelessness to exist. Truthfully, I can't either. I don't understand how, when presented with chances to secure funding for vital needs, our elected officials continue to balance the budget on the backs of our poorest neighbors. As a Jew, I've spent the past several weeks during the high holiday season thinking about the power of redemptive change. It's my hope that this body will realize that prioritizing the needs of our wealthiest while chronically underinvesting in our poorest neighbors is unjust and inconsistent with our self-proclaimed values as a progressive city. We cannot delay action any longer to correct for centuries of waste-based wealth disparities. Miriam's Kitchen calls on the council to reorient their attention away from a tax revision commission and towards acting now to ensure that all DC residents can pay their fair share so that all DC residents can thrive.
Thank you, Mr. Rabinowitz. And I believe that's all the witnesses with this panel. I'm going to begin and then go to my colleagues. And I'm not sure really that I have a question here so much as I want to react to some of the statements. As I said to the first panel, I'm just shocked that this idea of having a tax revision commission, which this council has established 3 times in the past 45 years, is meeting with opposition. And it seems that some of that opposition, a lot of that opposition is based on, well, we don't want to study it, we just want to raise taxes right now. But there have been some questions, there's been some discussion, well, how much? And aren't there some factors that we need to consider when we look at that? It's not just the simple, we'll turn the switch and taxes go up. They're on who and what should the rates be? And what are the, if we're looking at income tax, the comparative burden for each bracket? And there's been some interesting rhetoric in the testimony. Nobody suggested that a tax revision commission would work behind closed doors. I mean, there was some testimony that said that, but that's not in the bill. And we now have an Open Meetings Act, open meetings requirement. So that sounds good to say, well, I'm opposed to a tax revision commission that will operate behind closed doors. But that's made up. And then there was testimony about tone deafness. And that got me thinking, because I guess the point is that we need to be continually looking at whether we are doing enough and the right things. Enough and the right things. But the implication was also that the council's done nothing, or this government. And in fact, in the last 2 years, the last 2 budget cycles, we've raised taxes by over $150 million a year. $150 million a year. And when we raised taxes by over $100 million a year ago, we did that even though revenues were going up without tax increases by a couple $100 million a year. So that needs to be part of this consideration as well. And it's not right to so oversimplify the discussion to say, well, we're not increasing revenues, we're not looking at taxes at all, because we have. Both have happened. But there also is a question in my mind of how we're spending the money. And so when there's an accusation about tone deafness, and I forget how Mr. Nash put it, where he was pointing at me, which is okay, but it got me thinking about this as well. How do we spend our money? So just this week, the executive diverted almost 1/2 of the increase the council put in for affordable housing to a market rate for-profit housing development. 1/2 of the money. We increased money for affordable housing by about $88 million, and just under $40 million is proposed to be by DHCD to be diverted to a market rate project on New York Avenue. And I didn't hear any opposition from any of you. I didn't hear any opposition from the nonprofit housing development community. None, zero. So come to us and demand that we raise taxes, but then be silent when we find additional money and it gets diverted for another purpose. And the last thing I want to say is that several witnesses testified about how we ought to have a hearing on revenues. Well, we had a hearing. We had to hear 2 days of hearings, I want to say on June 18th, 19th, and there were a number of witnesses who came and testified about taxes. And we did this last year as well. There were witnesses who came and testified about taxes. But I wouldn't say that it was anywhere close to the thoughtfulness that we see with the Tax Revision Commission, which does considerable research and papers and analysis. Whether the commission recommends recommends consistent with some of that research, but all that's available to us. And it's far more than what we get from the hearing that we have. So the suggestion that we should just have a hearing, when we've done that, look at the testimony we've gotten there and look at how the council then acts. So this July, when we voted on the budget, a member came in and proposed repealing almost entirely the qualified high technology corporation tax. And to be sure, there were some problems with the QHTC. The statements that were made, including by the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, inaccurately represented what the CFO's research indicated with regard to this QHTC. But the council, without any hearing on it specifically, other than that June hearing where there was only the most superficial testimony, repealed almost all of it. Or the estate tax, which we changed the threshold without any debate, no debate at all. Or the income tax, where there was a proposal to increase it, which some of you, I think, opposed that increase because you didn't think it was enough, and the council rejected because there was no analysis around it. This is how we're doing tax policy today. That's my point. This is how we're doing tax policy today. And then the ad tax, which was proposed, the council approved unanimously and then unanimously repealed it. 2 weeks later, that idea, to broaden the sales tax, which is good tax policy to broaden the sales tax. We were doing all that on the fly without the kind of analysis that the Tax Revision Commission provided. So that's how we're doing tax policy now. And I say that in the context of so many of you opposing a Tax Revision Commission so that we can continue the way we are doing business with a hearing where there is only the most superficial testimony about taxes. And actually the kind of testimony that we're getting today, which doesn't get into the more specifics of what does it mean to be fair, or what is the best way to be progressive in our taxes. Without that kind, that's where we're doing it now. So I'm just saying that in response to all of this testimony that says, no, we shouldn't do a commission again. We should just go ahead and continue doing tax increases the way we have been. Councilmember Councilmember Pinto, I'm sorry. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Chairman Mendelson. I like Councilmember Brooko. You can go with that. So thank you all very much for for testifying and sharing your concerns and ideas for this commission. I have a question for Ms. Richards. You spoke about the importance of tax policy not being in a vacuum. And so I'm curious your view on the best way forward as we, try not to have such piecemeal approaches without analysis, as the chairman's referring to, but make sure that we address the very real needs of the city. Wouldn't a commission provide the best opportunity to return to our value set, get on the same page about which programs are necessary to be funded, and then determine the fairest way to raise the revenue around that? How is doing tax policy through the budget office on an individualized tax proposal basis not operating in a vacuum?
Because it's connected to the budget process and the spending side of the ledger. As I said in my testimony, the most important thing that taxes do at the state and local level is raise revenue for services and infrastructure. And, I really want to highlight something that Jesse Rabinowitz said in his excellent metaphor about the tidal wave. This economic crisis is harming DC residents right now, and all of the best economic literature indicates that the best response that states and localities can have, given their borrowing constraints, is to increase spending, not cut it, and do that funded through progressive revenue increases. So, I point you to the op-ed that's in the chat, but the basic gist is that when you cut services, when you fire teachers, when you fail to increase services for the needs that the community has, those cuts ripple through your economy and hamper your recovery, and they hamper your ability to raise revenue for years to come. So there's been research done after the Great Recession, states that increased progressive revenues instead of deep cuts had faster economic growth in the wake of the Great Recession. They had stronger recoveries. Josh Bivens from the Economic Policy Institute has estimated that if state and local austerity had ended and instead state and local spending had recovered to its trend pre-Great Recession, the national level recession would have been over and the recovery would have been complete 4 years earlier. I mean,
right.
We're talking about really serious issues here for DC's economy right now, and we have to focus on that.
Absolutely. And Ms. Richard, and I'll ask Zachary to comment on this as well briefly, because I have a couple more questions. It sounds like a lot of the witnesses are talking about the immediate need right now. And so if the Tax Reform Commission was decoupled from addressing the serious and immediate needs of our city given the crisis, would you be more comfortable with the idea of establishing a commission for responsible policy going forward for the next decade?
I'll just briefly say that I think that that's what the DC Council is elected to do, and that the best way to support your work on that is to have expert staff who can work with you on an ongoing basis and provide you with the information that you need to make what are fundamentally political and moral choices, not technocratic choices. It's just not the case that DC faces really complicated questions about how to deal with the mischaracterization of trust income. And you need to make decisions about who's going to pay what. And that's a political decision.
Yeah, I share Ms. Richards' view on this. You're right that there are some really hard and thorny problems that we need to solve. And what we need sometimes is exigency and efficiency, as we need now, but at all times, even not during a crisis, we also need expertise and accountability. And when we're looking for expertise, we want people who really understand things like, in Kitty's example, trust taxation. And the kinds of business executives who are typically named to the commission don't really bring meaningful expertise in those areas, nor do they bring accountability. You need support through policy expertise to queue up the decisions so that you can make the difficult moral and political decisions. And the kinds of people who tend to be on commissions don't meaningfully add that expertise. That's why we need in-house policy expertise. And further, those people who are the kinds on a commission tend not to face voters, understand voters' concerns, and are often chosen precisely to insulate from that kind of democratic accountability. So it's extremely important that the people who offer perspectives both have expertise and have accountability, and commissions, no matter whether in a crisis or not, lack both, which are essential to good outcomes.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'll ask this question to Amber and Jesse, and I mean this very genuinely and not sarcastically, but do you all have a framework that you would recommend we use for this question about fair share? I asked the previous panel as well if we can get advice from you all, from how you think that the definition of fair share should be determined and what metrics should we be using to guide that determination?
Thank you for the question. To me, your question illustrates really the core issue with this entire hearing and with the process that we have set up. So Chairman Mendelson mentioned that we often come to the Budget Support Act hearing and sort of testify broadly about revenue or tax ideas, because that hearing's not really on that. That hearing's on like the entire budget. It's on a specific proposal. And I think it was unfair to characterize our testimony as promoting maintaining the status quo, when in fact what we're asking for, what many of us are asking for, we're saying the Tax Revision Commission is the status quo. Making decisions at the end of budget season with no hearing process is the status quo. And what we're recommending is in-house expertise and an actual specific hearing process, so that somebody says, Councilmember Pinto, raise the taxes at this income bracket by this percentage. That's the proposal. Like every other bill that comes before the council, people can then come to a hearing and say that isn't fair or it should go further. And you can hear from experts, you can hear from taxpayers, you can hear from people who are personally affected one way or another, and you can have it within the context of the current revenue. That's actually what we're proposing, which is our democratic process, but has been sort of shunted into this tiny part of the budget process as it exists right now. And I know my testimony was really trying to push us away from the more elitist and esoteric aspect of tax policy and making it much more part of the public and accessible process.
And I'll just add for me that fairness looks like a staircase, right? The people who are making the least pay the least, the people who are making the most pay the most. And I think hopefully we can all fundamentally agree that a city where 7,000 people are sleeping without a place of their own, like that is not fair. People, like a city where people cannot afford to eat food, that's not fair. A city where some people are able to buy second houses or set up these educational pods for their private school kids, well, most kids are at home, like unable to do the remote learning, like that's not fair. So I think it helps me to define what fairness is by looking at what I think we can all agree is a fundamentally unfair system, which is what we have right now.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm out of time this round. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Silverman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I do want to take a moment to address your passionate response, particularly about spending. I am in complete agreement with you that we as a council need to focus more on agency oversight and spending. But I do think it's unfair to blame witnesses on this panel for not knowing about Doug Jamal trying to hijack $40 million of COVID recovery money for an application that was just submitted to DHCD last week. What I do want to do, Mr. Chairman, is applaud you and Councilmember Bonds for reading the Washington Business Journal story and doing the necessary oversight of DHCD and this program. I wish I could have had the opportunity to sign on to that letter with you. That is the council doing our job on oversight of agency spending. And I agree with you, we need to do it more. We need to take action like you and Councilmember Bonds took more often. But this hearing is on the Tax Revision Commission and how we raise revenue. I want to highlight a point that I think has been made by several witnesses, in that we as a state, and I consider us a state, have a different revenue approach as the federal government. In that, you say this all the time, Mr. Chairman, we don't have the luxury of being able to deficit spend. We need to balance our budget every budget season. And actually, as I think we'll learn at noon today, when the CFO apparently is going to make public the revenue estimates, we need to maintain a balanced budget throughout the year. And that makes our approach to revenue analysis and taxes different than the Fed's, in that this should be incorporated as part of our budget process. You know, I share your frustration that we ended up doing tax policy on the fly in the budget, Mr. Chairman. It should be incorporated, and the option should be presented to us as a council as part of the budget process. Now, let me specifically talk about the challenge we are in right now, the COVID challenge. You know, we have lost, I think, between FY 20 and 21, at least 1.5 billion. I think the revenue estimates, I think everyone, even on our own DC lottery gambling site, would probably give odds that the numbers are going to go down when we hear them in an hour. So, Ms. Richards, you mentioned the op-ed that you wrote in the New York Times. I think it directly addresses this issue of equity in the economic response to COVID. So can you just, for those who missed it, sort of give some highlights about, you know, or a top level summary about what should be those responses?
Sure, absolutely. On the point on equity, we actually have some data. It's relatively limited. Usually economic data comes out at a large lag, but the census is running a weekly survey called the Economic Pulse Survey that asks people, have you experienced a drop in your employment income? Have you lost your job? Do you expect to experience those things? And as of last week, about half of Americans had experienced a drop in their employment income since the beginning of the COVID crisis, which is really remarkable. But it means about half of people hadn't. And in fact, the chances that you had lost income or lost your job were much, much higher for low income people than they were for higher income people. And they were much lower for white people than they were for Black and Latinx respondents. And so what we're seeing here is that the COVID crisis is deeply unequally felt. And that's true in deaths as well as in economics. And it's layered on top, precisely recapitulating the deep inequality that already existed. So I think any just response needs to think about how we ask more from those who really can't afford it. I mean, people making over $200,000, 2/3 of them have seen zero economic losses since the beginning of this recession.
Let me pause you there.
Sure.
So, you know, we have embraced, I think, a progressive approach to taxation that's reflected in the prior tax commission, even if people have issues with the composition of it. So given that we embrace a progressive approach to taxation in COVID, what is the progressive response? What questions should we be asking and examining as we think about taxes and revenue raising in COVID?
Sure. You need to look at what your budget needs are, and you need to think more conceptually and creatively about, I don't know, maybe we could double schools funding and get education pods for all of the low income students who are currently at home with unstable internet connections. And as a DCPS parent, I can tell you that online learning is not working for my children, and I don't think it's working for others. You need to think big, and then we have the ability to raise income taxes. DC is so unequal that relatively small increases in income taxes at the high end can fund a lot of critical priorities. And frankly, they can fund priorities that are good for the wealthy as well. You cannot create a public school system on your own. You need to be able to pay taxes so that your kids can go to school. That's the kind of thing, but it's simple. It's increased income taxes. You need to look at increasing corporate taxes, which are only paid by profitable corporations. So if your business is taking a hit, you don't pay the corporate income tax, right? We don't need huge creative solutions. We need big thinking and then pretty simple tax policy.
So in my final minute, this issue of competitiveness, that was, I think, a driving principle of the prior commission. We need to be competitive with our regional partners and jurisdictions. So how do we tackle this issue of competitiveness while also trying to address the issue of equity?
So I think that Kamalika probably has some excellent talking points on competitiveness. I would say just the academic research is not supportive of the idea that cutting taxes is good for your local economy and your competitiveness. And, from a personal perspective, think about the people who've moved out of DC. They moved to Montgomery County for good schools and cheaper homes, and they pay higher property taxes than they do here.
Ms. Das, let me give you the last 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'd love to weigh in on that. I'm from New Jersey. I can say that critics have been claiming that high earners will flee New Jersey for decades. In 2004, Governor McGreevey raised the top rate from 6.37% to 8.97%. And since then, the number of millionaires has doubled. There's a reason wealthy households don't flee to lower tax neighboring states. It's because wealthy households can actually afford to prioritize their communities, their quality of life. You can have a better quality of life when you have higher taxes. You look at California's top marginal rate, it's 13.3%. They're proposing 16.8%. Nobody's really fleeing California right now. Kitty Richards talks about this vast number of experts who've already written about this. I can point you to the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality, Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. We don't need more research on this. There is enough that is out there about what competitiveness actually means.
I'm going to stop you there, Ms. Das, before I get in trouble with the chairman. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Bonds?
Okay, I'm very sorry, trying desperately to become unmuted. Thank you very much, Chairman, and thanks very much to this panel. I do have a few questions. One, in the mission of updating the district's tax code and sources of revenue, should we examine property tax rates as well as sales taxes and personal income taxes and even certain fees that we pay? And I'll ask Ms. Harding.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, I am asking, in the mission of updating the district's tax code and the sources of revenue, should we examine property tax rates as well as sales taxes, personal income tax, and even some of the fees that we collect? One comes to mind, speeding tickets. I get that complaint a lot. I'm sure you are aware.
Are you asking me because I was recently tweeting about my own experience with a speeding ticket? I feel like I can just speak from personal experience on that. So I love that question, Councilmember Bonds, because I'm going to talk about something like totally outside of my actual expertise. But I have always thought that DC should explore having fines that are income-based, like a progressive fine structure. There are models in other countries for it. And one of the reasons I really love it, beyond an idea of it being progressive and increasing revenue, is that there's a way to do it in a way that actually decreases racial profiling. So if you have speeding tickets, for instance, that are based on income, you start to flip the incentives for police officers that are, you know, implicit bias that happens where you actually have people pulling over different people if they're looking to increase the amount that they're pulling in. So there's a way to do some social engineering as well with policing that's always been really interesting to me, and I've always thought we should explore more. I also see the impact of fines on my clients who really can't afford to spend an entire day appealing a fine because they lose work and could lose their job. And there should be a process for people to submit that is income-based to be able to waive or lower fines. That isn't just like, there's a process now for mitigation where you can sort of explain the reason you were fined, but there's not an income-based process. And it wouldn't be that hard to develop that because we already have an appeals process where you can submit some materials. So that's something I've always really thought that we should explore. It takes some work. And like I said, it's outside of my general expertise. I've always been looking for someone to latch onto it and get excited about it and do that research. Again, I think there's a ton of opportunity to expand the way that we tax and the way that we think about it. And I'd love, you know, for people to think more about competitiveness, honestly, in a way of like, what would it look like for us to have the least amount of displacement, the lowest rates of homelessness, the lowest extreme poverty? You know, why don't we feel the drive, or why don't elected officials feel the same drive for competitiveness on the things that are really of high value to district residents?
Okay, so Ms. Hardy, are you also in favor of this mission and looking at the tax code, including property tax rates as an example, or just the fees?
I'm in favor of you looking at all the things and then presenting it forward and having public hearings where we talk about each thing specifically and we talk about the pros and cons like we do with any other bill that comes before the council.
All right, well, thank you. Let's see, Reverend Davis, what do you think about how we should expand use of the tax code?
I commend exactly what Ms. Harding ended on there. I think it's our job as citizens to compel and hold our council members and elected officials to keep studying. And, you know, I think that come to us with more proposals. Let's have more and more hearings. I'm open to hearing. I think it's wide open, and it needs to be particularly wide open now and today.
All right, thank you. Mr. Nash, could I ask you if, for instance, the commission is charged with reducing the wealth gap and addressing the processes for the city to continue or keep businesses afloat, what time frame do you feel would be needed to address these issues? A year, 3 months, 10 years?
Yeah, well, I can tell you from my own experience, what I am most worried about is this winter, okay? We've got, I'm seeing increases in homelessness. Would you want to go to a shelter right now? So get it, whatever you're going to do, you know, we got to get something going before the weather gets cold. And last night it already. Does that answer your question? Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Definitely, definitely. And I wish we had time to have a extended discussion about homelessness. You know, the Housing Committee is very concerned about that arena, and particularly as we, as a city, have committed to getting everyone off the street into a unit. My concern is, I get you in a unit, how can I keep you in the unit? And so we need to have far more discussion about that. But today, of course, we're talking about what we should do in order to update our tax code. And so just trying to, at random, you know, I don't know who considers themselves an expert on these matters, because you made it very clear that you expect the council to be experts to some degree. And the chairman has pointed out the role that we have played somewhat willy-nilly changing and what have you, trying to do the best that we can without the expertise. And so I'm very concerned that we do get the best advice that we can get, but I too want it to happen as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and if I could just add one thing, that I wish we could reframe competitiveness in terms of competitiveness of social equity, because many high-income people, myself is one of them, and I think we heard from at least one other today, this is what matters to me, and this is what's going to drive where I live. So if you want to keep high-income people, get it done.
All right, thank you. Mr. Pitney, what are your thoughts about what should be included in the revision of the tax code?
Yeah, so I appreciated your comment on the expert thing. I really don't feel like I'm an expert, but one of the things that I hope gets more considered is how do we tax wealth? You know, how do we move money from the places where it's just causing damage, you know, in by its very just state of being there, to where it's needed and can make communities better. You know, so yeah, just looking creatively at ways to target wealth and take advantage of people that want to pay more in taxes.
Yeah, I mean, I understand what I'm hearing. I know, yes. Chairman, thank you very much. I've run out of time. I was going to speak about Amazon and Apple and how they pay no taxes, but thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, and I think you got that point in. Councilmember,
thank you.
Councilmember Che.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and hello to everybody, and thank you for the witnesses coming in. I'm a little confounded by the debate so far. The idea about reestablishing the Tax Revision Commission arises from an instinct that some of you have shared, that it's a good thing to have an entity that would harness expertise and look comprehensively at our tax code, both going back and going forward, and to make recommendations to the council. Recommendations. And even some folks who've applauded the recommendations of the previous tax commission, saying that they were progressive and bold changes, and lamenting the fact that some of them weren't implemented. And yet, this has become more a debate about the merits of a tax on the wealthy. And that's fine. But let's be clear about something. Having a tax commission to do this work, and they are recommendations, which again, many of you liked of the last experience. It's no abdication of responsibility of the council. There's no loss of our authority, no loss of our decision-making, no loss of our ability to make decisions urgently as needed. It's supposed to be the adjunct, if you will, to what we do. We're still responsible. We remain responsible. And so, again, I might even agree that we should have a tax on, or a higher tax on people who have more money. But that position is not compromised or undermined or in any sense affected by the fact that I think we could get a great benefit out of a tax revision commission. And thank you, Councilmember Bonds, for pointing out the questions. What should be included? We can be directive with the commission. We can say, look, we want you to consider these sources of revenue and these sources of revenue. And I was struck, by the way, by the, and this is like somewhat of a digression, but if we're going to consider fees and fines, and if we want fines to be progressive, and if we think that, well, that'll probably make the enforcers focus less on some folks than on others so that we could make sure our revenues are high. Fines are not there for revenue raising. That is bad policy. And so I would hope that nobody would do that. I have railed against increasing the fines on these automated cameras for years. It's clear, the data is clear. You only need a fine of a certain amount, not these exorbitant fines that we have that are revenue raisers. And whoever says that they are not is just not being honest. So yes, let's broaden the lens and look at many of these things. But when we do that, fines are not supposed to be revenue raisers. So I'm confused by this debate. I think there's an illogic to saying that this issue of a tax commission is going to get in the way of our authority, our responsibility, our decision to make urgent decisions. I don't think that is true. And it's like a stalking horse. You want to talk about raising taxes on the wealthy? We can certainly talk about that. And we can certainly make a decision about that. This is not an obstacle. In any case, I don't have questions. I just wanted to, as politicians do, make a statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Chair, and I'm going to exercise Chairman's prerogative and make a couple of comments. Councilmember Che, your comment about fines reminded me about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, there was enormous controversy when it was discovered that with the photo enforcement, that the contractor was being paid on a per ticket basis. And it was felt that that incentivized the issuance of these tickets. By
the way, that's unconstitutional. It violates due process, but go ahead.
Well, and as you said, that's contrary to the policy that we want. We don't want to be thinking of or have fines in such a way that their enforcement appears to be about raising money as opposed to compliance. The other comment I want to make is just to clarify with regard to the project about which I spoke when I spoke a little while ago. So there is this development project. I intentionally didn't mention who the developer's name was. And DHCD advertised on September 21st that it was going to redirect just under $40 million from what the council clearly designated in the budget as going for HPTF, that's Housing Production Trust Fund purposes. And the point that I was making was that the advocacy community, as far as I know, has been silent. So it's easy for advocates to come to the council and say, we want you to spend more, we want you to tax more, we want you to spend more. But we have to look at the spending side, and here was a case in point, very recent, of substantial dollars. Just to give a sense of context, at our last meeting in July, I believe it was our last meeting in July, the council member proposed to increase the income tax rate for the highest earners. That proposal, which was not approved by the council, would have brought in about $8 million. This housing project, or the money that was diverted, is close to $40 million. That's 5 times more, 500% more that we're talking about. Now, it was suggested that, well, Councilmember Bonds and I learned about this from a Washington Journal article, Washington Business Journal article. And it's true, the Washington Business Journal wrote about this on Monday, and Councilmember Bonds and I sent the letter on Monday. We actually learned about it from the advocacy community. They alerted us last week. But as far as I know, they didn't raise protests. Possibly because they didn't want to jeopardize other projects that are important that need to get HPTF money. I don't care. In my view, the letter that Councilmember Bonds and I hope will be effective, but for sure it's more likely to be effective if the public, if you all express outrage. When it's left to Councilmember Bonds and me, the two of us, maybe some quiet noise from the other advocates who brought it to our attention, but no further advocacy than that. I have to say, why is all the energy coming to us to raise taxes, and there's not an equal amount of energy being directed in this case to DHCD by those who brought it to our attention and who know this and follow this on a daily basis. The spending side is as important. We can raise taxes as we've done. As we did, I pointed out $150 million, at least in the last 2 years. I say that based on memory. We can raise taxes. And if that money's still not going the way you all want it to be spent, we're not accomplishing the goals that you're advocating. The record in this matter will be open for 2 weeks. I want to thank each of you for your testimony and for your time and for putting up with my last speech. Anybody who wants to supplement their testimony, anybody who was paying attention but didn't testify and wants to comment, 2 weeks, 5 o'clock, October 14th. And I believe there were a couple of witnesses who testified, Mr. Pitney, Ms. West Rasmus, Ms. Richards, I already asked you, Reverend Davis, we didn't get copies of your statements. Please, within the next 2 weeks, 5 p.m., October 14th. That's going to conclude this hearing. The time is 11, again, I want to thank each of you and the prior panel. The time is 11:48 in the morning and this hearing is adjourned.